In 1962, when Hollywood assembled its account of D-Day, the actor playing Major John Howard at Pegasus Bridge had already been at that bridge for real. Richard Todd wasn't cast as a symbol. He had been there, in the dark, on the actual night. Not as a glider infantryman, but as a paratrooper with the 7th Light Infantry Parachute Battalion, part of the force sent to relieve Howard's glider coup de main. He had parachuted into Normandy, moved through the darkness toward the Caen Canal, crossed the captured bridge, and met Major Howard face to face before dawn. 18 years later, on a film set at the original location, he stood in Howard's place and played the man he had once reported to. That is the loop at the center of this story. One soldier, one bridge, two performances. The first in combat, the second on camera. And in the gap between those two events, the British half of the D-Day story was quietly absorbed into a larger American frame until the glider war that opened the eastern flank became a footnote in someone else's narrative. The Longest Day at least put British storylines on screen. The 1962 film had British directors shooting British sequences, a substantial British cast, and Howard himself present on set as a consultant. Yet the cultural memory that settled around it ran toward John Wayne wading ashore and Robert Mitchum gesturing from the bluffs. British content stayed in the film, but it didn't stay in the same place in public memory. Then, in 1998, a film about Omaha Beach grossed approximately $481 million, won 5 Academy Awards, and permanently branded June 6th as an American story told in American blood. The bridge didn't move, the history didn't change. What changed was who got to remember it. The coup de main at Pegasus Bridge began on the ground at RAF Tarrant Rushton at 22:56 on 5th of June 1944. 6 Horsa gliders were towed into the night sky by Halifax bombers, each glider carrying approximately 28 heavily armed troops, plus sappers from the 249th Airborne Field Company. Total force, 181 men. Commander, Major John Howard. D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Their objective was to seize 2 bridges intact, the Bénouville Bridge over the Caen Canal and the Ranville Bridge over the River Orne, before dawn, before any Allied boot had touched a landing beach. Howard watched his men board in the dark. He recorded later, "It was an amazing sight. The smaller chaps were visibly sagging at the knees under the amount of kit they had to carry." What they carried wasn't only weapons and ammunition. On their shoulders rested, as one account of the mission puts it, responsibility for securing the left flank of the entire Allied invasion force. The Horsa was built of wood, plywood and spruce, fabric stretched over the surfaces, constructed to land once and never fly again. The 6 Halifax bombers crossed the channel toward the Normandy coast, each towing a Horsa through the dark. The crews understood what they carried. At a minimum, failure at those bridges could have made D-Day far more costly to the Allies. At a maximum, failure might have endangered the invasion as a whole. When the Halifax released each glider over the Normandy coast, glider number 1 at roughly 6,000 feet, piloted by Staff Sergeant James Walwork of the Glider Pilot Regiment, the engine noise fell away completely. Inside the aircraft, the men felt the shift immediately. What remained was airflow and the structural sounds of wood under tension, and pilot accounts describe the final descent as surprisingly quiet, calmer than anticipated. A contemporary evaluation from the World War II Glider Pilots Association noted specifically the absence of expected rushing air noise. The Horsa's aerodynamic profile smoothed the approach in ways that struck experienced pilots as uncanny. Not a roaring dive toward the dark fields below, a hush. 6 wooden aircraft gliding in silence toward objectives their pilots couldn't yet see. Warwick, guiding glider number 1 toward the Caen Canal bridge, described what he found when the coast came into view. We could see the twin waterways of the river and canal like silver in the moonlight, which was a little better than half and more than we had hoped for. And the bridges now showed clearly. He held course meticulously, resisting the temptation to fly by instinct. The last leg brought us directly in line with the canal and, behold, the bridge. We were a little high, so half flap and steady in at 90 miles per hour. In the rear of the same glider, Howard's men linked arms in the darkness. Howard described the drill. Our enthusiasm to get the job done overcame fear. The landing drill was to link arms with the man on either side of you, then butcher's grip your fingers, lift your feet, and pray that your number wasn't up. In another glider, Lieutenant Todd Sweeney leaned into the cockpit doorway as the coast came up. His pilot shouted, "There you are!" and Sweeney saw, in the spotty moonlight, the thin silver thread of the river, and then the 2 bridges. Warwick called out to hold tight as the ground rushed up. Full flap. The glider streamed its braking chute, and then the impact. Howard recorded it with the same cadence of surprise that every account of Pegasus Bridge carries. Before we almost had time to do that, there was the first thump of a landing, and it was a hell of a crash. And before we knew it, we were airborne again. We'd obviously bounced. The wheels had gone on the first contact. The glider bounced again, trailing sparks from the wire. Howard saw the sparks through the doorframe and thought for a split second that the Germans were already firing, that the entire surprise had been lost. Then the glider stopped. No firing. Darkness. It occurred to me that there was no firing, and I couldn't see anything. The first fear was that I'd been blinded in the crash. I felt my body, that felt all right, and then I realized that all that happened was my battle bowler had come down over my eyes. I'd hit the top of the glider. He pushed the helmet up. He was approximately 30 meters from Pegasus Bridge. The nose of the aircraft had punched through the barbed wire defences. Warwick and his co-pilot, Staff Sergeant John Ainsworth, had been thrown from the cockpit on impact and lay dazed in the wire. Around Howard, men were already moving. The 2 German sentries on the bridge heard the crash. One managed to fire a flare pistol before Lieutenant Den Brotheridge shot him. But the defenders in their gun pits were caught so utterly by surprise that some were still asleep. The first glider at the canal bridge had landed at 0016. The other 2 assigned to that objective followed within the minute. The second glider breaking in 2 as it hit the ground and stopping at the edge of a pond. Lance Corporal Fred Greenhalgh was thrown unconscious into the water and drowned. The first Allied soldier to die in the liberation of Europe, before Brotheridge crossed the bridge. Brotheridge himself was shot in the neck while leading the charge across. He completed the crossing before collapsing. He died shortly after, without regaining consciousness. He was 28 years old. His wife was pregnant. Their daughter was born 19 days later, not knowing what had happened to her father. He is documented as the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day. Before the airborne mass drops, before the naval bombardment, before any landing craft approached Sword Beach. Warwick described the final accounting of what they had done. That was when the singing stopped and the silent flight started. And that was when 6 horses tiptoed quietly into 2 little fields in Normandy, releasing 180 fighting men in full battle order to give the German garrison the surprise of their lives and a lesson in taking a bridge. Within 10 minutes, both Pegasus Bridge and the Orne River Bridge were in British hands, intact, demolition charges unset. The sappers from the 249th Field Company moved immediately. Both bridges had been prepared for demolition, but the explosives had not actually been installed. They were stored nearby, requiring a direct order from German High Command to set. That order never came in time. Howard transmitted the code word ham and jam. Both bridges taken. Howard's men dug in and waited. They had no heavy weapons against armour. The 21st Panzer Division, the only German armoured formation close enough to mount a ground counterattack on D-Day itself, its 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, positioned east of Caen, was precisely the threat the bridges were seized to contain. Critically, Hitler was asleep in Berlin that morning, and his staff refused to authorise moving the panzers without his direct order. The delay gave Howard's force, and the paratroopers arriving to relieve them, enough time to establish a defensive line. When 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment finally attacked around midday, British forces had been holding the bridges for 12 hours. German forces took significant armoured losses and pulled back. One of Howard's men lay in a hedgerow with a Piat, waiting for the first German armoured vehicle to enter range. Piats were short-range weapons, effective at 30 to 40 yards, not much use at 50, which meant holding position and waiting while the tank kept coming. He waited, fired, and hit. That tank stopped. The others, uncertain what strength they faced, withdrew for the time being. The bridges held. Richard Todd came in at approximately 0040 on 6th of June, roughly 25 minutes after Walwork's glider hit the wire. He arrived by parachute from a different aircraft with a different formation. He was a lieutenant, not yet a captain. Promotion wouldn't come for another 5 days while he was still in the bridge defence area, serving as assistant adjutant in HQ Company of the 7th Light Infantry Parachute Battalion, 5th Parachute Brigade, 6th Airborne Division. His battalion's mission was specifically to relieve Howard's coup de main force and establish a western bridgehead around the captured bridges. He landed in a cornfield. His own account, preserved in the Pegasus archive, describes the task briefing with precision. We of 7 Para were to relieve the glider party on the bridges and establish a western bridgehead. He described himself, with dry accuracy, as an illegal immigrant without a passport, but nevertheless welcome, I hoped. The drop had scattered the battalion widely. Parachute landings rarely concentrate forces the way gliders do, and about 150 men regrouped by approximately 1:30 before setting off toward the bridges. The 7th Para reached Pegasus Bridge, and Howard's exhausted force was relieved around 300. During that handover, Todd met Howard at the bridge. The same bridge, the same dark morning, the living outcome of the glider assault standing directly in front of him. He was there. The physical bridge, the actual hours, the man he would later play, Todd encountered all three before the seaborne landings had begun. The distinction matters for precision. Todd didn't take the bridge in the gliders. Howard and D Company and Walworks Flying took the bridge. But Todd arrived as part of the 1st Reinforcing Paratroopers, was physically present at one of the most consequential positions on the entire Allied front within hours of its capture, and in the days that followed helped defend it against the German counterattacks that came through the morning and afternoon. He engaged German troops approaching by canal boat. His unit described the action as something close to a naval skirmish. He was promoted to captain 5 days after D-Day, still in the bridge defence area, still on the same contested ground. He donated the webbing he wore that night to the Café Gondry beside the bridge, the first building to be liberated in France, its owner, Georges Gondry, having buried 98 bottles of champagne in the garden throughout the German occupation, digging them up when Howard's men arrived. When The Longest Day went into production 18 years later, Todd brought his own wartime red parachute beret to the set and wore it on camera, changing only the cap badge to that of the Ox and Bucks, Howard's regiment, rather than the para badge he had actually worn at the bridge. His own beret, his own wartime equipment, the same ground. He crossed the bridge in 1944 as a soldier. He crossed it again in 1962 as an actor. The same earth, the same man. Different purpose, but nothing invented. Major John Howard wasn't from the officer class. Born in December 1912 in London's West End, he had left school at 14, worked for a time as a barrel maker, spent 6 years in the army as a private soldier and NCO before discharging in 1938 to join the Oxford City Police. Recalled to service in December 1939, he rose with striking speed. Regimental Sergeant Major within 5 months, commissioned as Second Lieutenant in November 1940, Major by May 1942, and command of D Company shortly after. The Army was finding its capable men wherever it could find them. His selection for the Pegasus Bridge mission reflected what Howard had built D Company into over 2 years. He had rehearsed the assault on replica bridges in England, built detailed mock-ups from aerial photographs updated daily as the Germans modified their defences, had his men practice night fighting until it was habitual and fast. When the Germans cut down trees in the photographs, the model makers in England did the same. The model evolved daily. Intelligence gathered from the Café Gondry, where owner Georges Gondry and his wife Thérèse, fluent in German, listened to the soldiers who drank there and passed what she heard along, fed into that preparation. By the time Howard's men boarded their gliders at Tarrant Rushton, they knew the objective as thoroughly as training and imagination could make possible. The division commander, Major General Richard Gale, had told Brigadier Kindersley in the planning stages, "The seizing of the bridges intact is of the utmost importance for the conduct of future operations. The speedy overpowering of the bridge defences will be your first objective, and it's therefore to be seized by the coup de main party. You must accept risks to achieve this." Montgomery presented Howard with the Distinguished Service Order on the 16th of July 1944. 4 months later, in November, a collision with an American Army truck on a French road shattered Howard's lower body. Long hospitalization, invalided out in 1946. He had survived the night that should have killed him and was destroyed months later on an ordinary road. He returned to Bénouville nearly every June for the rest of his life. In 1981, during a veterans' battlefield tour led by historian Stephen Ambrose, Howard reportedly approached Ambrose's bus, boarded it, and announced, "Perhaps I can add something. I'm John Howard." Ambrose's book, Pegasus Bridge, published in 1984, grew directly from that encounter and the oral history that followed. Howard became Ambrose's primary source. When The Longest Day came out in 1962, Howard had advised on the film personally. Interviewed on the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, he laughed at his portrayal. The BBC, drawing on that interview, quotes him describing what he saw on screen as sentimental rubbish. His commanding officer's instruction to hold until relieved, rendered in the film as a disembodied, portentous voice, was, in Howard's experienced and slightly impatient view, simply a professional order, one that any competent soldier would follow without needing it dramatized from the heavens. He died on the 5th of May 1999, aged 86. His daughter Penny published his private papers in 2006 as the Pegasus Diaries. To understand what the seizure of Pegasus Bridge actually meant operationally, the geography has to be clear. The Caen Canal and the River Orne run roughly parallel between the sea and Caen, forming a natural water barrier east of the Allied landing zone. Pegasus Bridge was the critical crossing point in this sector. The Orne Bridge, approximately 500 metres to the east, was its necessary partner. Together, they determined whether German armoured forces could drive westward to strike the left flank of Sword Beach before the British 3rd Infantry Division was properly established ashore, and whether the 6th Airborne Division, already dropped east of the waterline, could receive any reinforcement or supply from the seaborne force at all. If those bridges stayed in German hands or were demolished, the 21st Panzer Division had a crossing route the British didn't control. Allied forces landing at Sword Beach had no lateral route eastward. The 6th Airborne, whose entire job was protecting that eastern shoulder, would be cut off from resupply. A coordinated German armoured counterattack in the hours after the beach landings, before the Allies could bring armour off the beaches themselves, could have struck a flank with no defence in depth. The Panzer Grenadiers who attacked at midday on D-Day and took significant armoured losses at the bridges were attacking a position that had been held for 12 hours by a force that started with 181 men and no anti-tank guns beyond a handful of Piats. The margin was genuinely narrow. The 6th Airborne's entire D-Day mission, protecting the eastern shoulder of the invasion so that Sword Beach could land and advance, was built on the assumption that those two bridges would be in British hands before the first seaborne soldier waded ashore. Howard's 181 men delivered that assumption into operational fact at 0016 on the 6th of June 1944. The rest of the Eastern Plan then became possible. This isn't tourist history inflating a bridge's importance for the benefit of a local museum. This is the operational logic the planners built the entire Eastern Airborne component around. The 10 minutes in which D Company secured both bridges was a precondition for what could happen anywhere on the eastern sector that day. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge was dying on the bridge he had just crossed before the naval bombardment began. The British and Canadian seaborne landings on D-Day are rarely framed in a way that matches their actual scale. Published figures for 6th of June 1944 list roughly 94,000 British and Canadian seaborne troops landing on Gold, Juno and Sword, alongside roughly 59,000 Americans at Utah and Omaha combined. On top of this, the 6th British Airborne Division was already east of the Orne when the naval guns opened. The opening ground action of the eastern flank had been carried out by 181 men in 6 gliders, while most of those 59,000 Americans were still aboard ships. The invasion wasn't a predominantly American operation in its military composition. It was a joint operation in which British and Canadian forces constituted the larger share of the seaborne assault, with British Airborne on the eastern flank and American Airborne on the western. The military balance was genuinely multinational. The cultural inheritance isn't.
Ask someone to describe D-Day in a single image, and they will almost certainly produce an American landing craft, an American beach, American soldiers waist-deep in surf. The gap between military fact and collective memory is the result of specific cultural machinery. Machinery that began operating in 1962 and reached its full power in 1998. The Longest Day, released in October 1962, was a serious effort at multinational history. Producer Zanuck hired 3 separate directors for 3 national perspectives. Ken Anakin shot the British and French exterior sequences, Andrew Martin, the American, Bernhard Vicky, the German. The film ran 178 minutes. The British cast was substantive. Richard Burton as an RAF pilot, Sean Connery as an infantry private with the 3rd Infantry Division, Peter Lawford as Lord Lovat, Kenneth Moore as a Royal Navy beachmaster at Juno, and Richard Todd as Major John Howard. 500 British Army soldiers appeared as extras. Noel Coward contributed to the British screenplay dialogue. The film's own production records show that both John Howard and Lord Lovat served as consultants during production. Philippe Kieffer, who led the Free French Commandos at Ouistreham, also advised. Real participants were in the room while the drama about them was assembled. The film's Wikipedia entry states it plainly. Todd participated in the assault on Pegasus Bridge in the early hours of D-Day. The people who made The Longest Day knew exactly who they had cast and why. And yet, one period review of the film observed plainly that there was a calculated decision to make audiences wait for the two major stars, John Wayne and Robert Mitchum. Those stars were American. Their sequences depicted American beaches. John Wayne, who hadn't served in the war and reportedly demanded $250,000 when every other major cast member had accepted $25,000, played a lieutenant colonel who had been 27 years old on the actual day. Wayne was 55. The casting wasn't historical, it was commercial. Robert Mitchum commanded the Omaha sequences with the kind of gravitas that belongs to a man born to anchor films, and those sequences, the scale of them, the American faces in them, became the film's memorable core in popular recall, regardless of what else Zanuck had assembled around them. Howard watched an actor play him and laughed at what came out. The real participants were present. The memory that formed around the film still defaulted to the beach and the Americans on it. The film tried. Memory still failed. The mechanism isn't malice. It's the gravitational pull of star power, marketing weight, and the national appetite that the largest cinema market in the world naturally brings to its own stories. What The Longest Day couldn't overcome was the commercial logic that had John Wayne on its posters and Mitchum on its Omaha sequences, while the British content, however genuine, however consultantly precise, sat within a frame that audiences read as American by default. Richard Todd's casting was the film's most honest act. A man who had been at the bridge played the commander of the bridge on the original ground. And still the cultural memory drifted elsewhere. If that fact doesn't constitute evidence of a structural problem with how D-Day was being told on screen, it's difficult to know what would. Then, Saving Private Ryan arrived in 1998 and settled the question for a generation. Spielberg's film opens with the Omaha Beach assault. The sequence runs approximately 24 to 25 minutes. American soldiers under fire, American dead in the surf, American suffering rendered with a technical precision the cinema screen had not previously attempted for infantry combat at this scale. The cinematography desaturated color and simulated the visual distortion of shock and extreme adrenaline. The sound design layered individual sounds inside a cacophony that felt physiologically accurate, the way hearing actually behaves under sustained extreme noise. Men drowned, weighed down by equipment they couldn't shed fast enough. Men were hit and died while the camera watched without flinching and without sentimentality. It was the most immersive war film made to that point. And it arrived with the full weight of Steven Spielberg's reputation and DreamWorks' marketing reach behind it. The awards reflected it. 5 Academy Awards at the 71st ceremony in 1999. Best Director for Spielberg, Best Cinematography, Best Sound, Best Film Editing, and Best Sound Effects Editing. The film didn't win Best Picture. Shakespeare in Love took that, in an outcome that caused considerable industry controversy at the time. But Best Director and 4 technical awards constituted cultural authentication of the highest order. The worldwide gross reached approximately $481 million,
At the time, the highest-grossing war film ever made, the second highest-grossing film of 1998 overall. What Saving Private Ryan did, beyond its undeniable technical achievement and its enormous commercial reach, was brand D-Day. Not as a campaign across 5 beaches involving multiple Allied nations and 2 separate airborne operations. Not as the opening move of the eastern flank by 6 wooden gliders in the dark, or the Canadian drive inland from Juno, or the British 3rd Division's fight toward Caen from Sword. It branded D-Day as a single beach, soaked in American blood, remembered through American grief. The opening sequence is so viscerally authoritative that it functions in popular memory less as a depiction of one component of the invasion and more as a definition of the entire event. British critics and historians documented the distortion at the time. Academic studies followed. A British television D-Day documentary, broadcast in the same period, was described in academic literature as conceived partly as a riposte to Saving Private Ryan, which had attracted criticism. Criticism that the film had compressed the Allied invasion of Western Europe into a specifically American narrative. The word riposte is accurate. British filmmakers and historians felt the need to argue back, in the language of film, against an American film's account of an operation in which British and Canadian forces constituted the larger part of the seaborne assault. They argued back. They made the documentary. It received respectful reviews and academic attention and had approximately no effect on the default cultural image of D-Day that Saving Private Ryan had installed. By the time the film's afterlife was fully established, via home video, streaming, anniversary broadcasts, use in schools as the primary visual reference for 6th of June 1944, Pegasus Bridge had become, for most people, a sequence in an older black-and-white film. Something with a cafe and a piper. Something that fitted inside a longer American story about the day the free world arrived on the coast of France. The 6 wooden horses, the silent descent, the 10 minutes in which Howard's men secured both bridges before the naval guns fired. That story sat behind the dominant image rather than in front of it. Back then, to Richard Todd on the film set. In The Longest Day, there is a moment when the paratroopers of the 7th Battalion arrive to relieve Howard's force at the bridge. The actor playing Howard delivers a line to the paratroopers along the lines that they are, as always, late. Multiple secondary accounts describe this as a private in-joke, understood by those who knew, because the actor playing Howard was himself a former officer of 7 Para, one of the actual men who had arrived to relieve the real Howard on the actual morning 18 years before. Whether the line was deliberately scripted with that particular irony in mind isn't confirmed by available production records. But Todd knew what it meant. Howard was on set. Both men were present at a joke that only people who had been at the bridge in 1944 could fully understand. What is confirmed by the Wikipedia article on the film itself. Another actor, Patrick Jordan, played Lieutenant Richard Todd in the same Pegasus Bridge sequence. Todd, playing Howard, performed opposite the man playing his younger self. He described the experience. The attribution comes from a Sandhurst Trust institutional profile and should be treated as secondary rather than primary sourcing, as feeling like he was standing beside myself, talking to myself. Multiple secondary sources, including the film's Wikipedia article, state that Todd was offered the chance to portray himself in The Longest Day and chose to play Howard instead. If that account is accurate, the choice was deliberate. Todd set aside the opportunity to position himself as a celebrity reenacting his own wartime service, and stepped instead into the role of the man whose force he had been sent to relieve. He wore his own wartime red parachute beret, changed only the cap badge.
He played the commander on the same ground where, in 1944, he had been the lieutenant arriving after the bridge was already taken. Howard was on set watching. He laughed at what he saw, described it as sentimental rubbish, returned to Normandy for the next 37 years on every anniversary he could manage. But the fact of the situation can't be reduced to sentiment or to trivia. A man who had been at Pegasus Bridge in 1944 played Major John Howard in 1962, opposite an actor playing the younger version of himself on the actual ground where it happened. The soldiers were present at the making of the film about themselves. The film was made at the actual bridge, and the memory still drifted toward John Wayne and Omaha. That is the mechanism. Not conspiracy, not deliberate erasure, but the steady gravitational pull of commercial scale, star power, and the size of the American film market applied to a story that belonged to multiple nations. The British half of D-Day found its way onto screen in 1962, and a real soldier had to play his own commander to put it there. Even that wasn't enough. 52 years after The Longest Day opened, the BBC ran an anniversary piece drawing on a 1994 interview Howard had given. In that interview, Howard described the glider landing with complete technical precision: the butcher's grip, the locked arms, the crash, the bounce, the sparks he mistook for tracer fire, and then the darkness after the aircraft stopped. "It occurred to me that there was no firing," he said, "and I couldn't see anything. The first fear was that I'd been blinded in the crash. I felt my body, that felt all right, and then I realized that all that happened was my battle bowler had come down over my eyes. I'd hit the top of the glider." His glider had stopped with its nose inside the barbed wire, within 30 meters of Pegasus Bridge. He pushed the helmet up. He collected himself. He issued orders. That interview, that man, that story made the BBC's anniversary coverage in 2014. It didn't make the cultural inheritance most of the world carries when it thinks about 6th of June 1944. Howard died in May 1999. Richard Todd died in December 2009. Between the two of them, they embodied the complete arc of the problem: the operation itself, the film that tried to preserve it, and the soldier who moved between combat and cinema and found himself watching another man play his younger self while he played his commanding officer. Todd had volunteered for airborne forces in late 1943, completed Parachute Course 89. His assessment record noted he jumps well, cheerful, fine example to his men, and was posted to 7 Para specifically. His path brought him to Pegasus Bridge on the night of 6th of June 1944, and then back to the same bridge for the cameras. The 3 Horsa gliders that delivered D Company to Pegasus Bridge can be seen in aerial photographs taken in the days after D-Day. Their wooden frames collapsed in the fields beside the canal they had carried men to. They were designed to be disposable: land once, shatter on impact, release the troops, serve no further purpose. The bridge itself was replaced in 1994 when the canal was widened. The original was moved to dry land and eventually purchased by the Pegasus Bridge Memorial for the symbolic price of 1 French franc. It sits under cover, a short walk from its original position. The actual bridge, the actual wood, the structure that Woolworks nose cone stopped against at 0016 on 6th of June 1944. The gliders were designed to disappear into the ground. The British half of the story has been, in a different way, gradually disappearing into the background of a larger and louder narrative for 80 years. The argument here isn't primarily about grievance. It's about mechanics. the specific process by which a multinational military operation acquired a cultural identity that maps onto only one of its national contributions. A 178-minute film made in 1962 genuinely tried to represent the full picture. It put British men at the British bridges, employed British directors for British sequences, placed actual survivors in the room with the actors playing them. Richard Todd, present at Pegasus Bridge on 6th of June 1944 as a lieutenant in the 7th Parachute Battalion, promoted to captain 5 days later while still in the bridge defence area, played Major John Howard opposite an actor playing his own younger self, wearing his own wartime beret on the actual ground. Howard was there. Lovett was there. The film was as honest as a dramatisation can reasonably be. Memory still pulled toward John Wayne and Omaha. Saving Private Ryan then made the American beach so immersive and so total. Roughly $481 million of persuasion, 5 Academy Awards of cultural authentication, an opening sequence of approximately 24 to 25 minutes that functions as a definition of the event, that it occupied the entire space where a more complete memory could have lived. The British glider assault on Pegasus Bridge came first. At 0016 on 6th of June 1944, Woolworks Horsa stopped with its nose in the wire. Howard's men were out and running before the German sentries could fully react. Both bridges were secured in 10 minutes. Brotheridge was dying on the bridge he had just crossed. The eastern flank was held before the first naval shell fell, before the first American paratrooper hit the ground on the Cotontam Peninsula, before Omaha Beach existed as anything other than a coordinate on a planning map. Richard Todd was in the air above Normandy when the bridges were taken. He landed 25 minutes later, gathered with roughly 150 men of his scattered battalion, moved through the dark toward the canal, crossed the bridge, and met John Howard on the ground Howard had just seized. 18 years later, he stood on the same ground and played Howard for the camera. He brought his own wartime beret. He reportedly chose Howard's role over his own. And Howard, advised, consulted, present on set, described the whole cinematic exercise as sentimental rubbish, and returned to Normandy almost every June until he died. The eastern flank was seized in silence by 6 wooden gliders in the dark. The world's memory of D-Day was seized later by a different kind of machine. Louder, more expensive, capable of running for decades and seeding itself into the curricula of schools on both sides of the Atlantic. Richard Todd is the hinge between those two facts. He crossed Pegasus Bridge in 1944 as a soldier and again in 1962 as an actor. Once that hinge is visible, the American-only account of June 6 no longer holds together the way it appears to. The glider war came first, the film came after, and the soldier who lived both had to become the movie. Subscribe for more stories like this.